Hey, what's up, guys? Little man with a big opinion here. It is very rainy. It's going to be rainy for the next 2 or 3 days. It's been rainy for the last 2 or 3 days. Haven't been able to work on the fence, and I said I would show y'all some skill stuff that I know. And I really wanted to do knots and show off some lashings, which I can do in the space behind me. I've got several spars and a lot of rope. I might do that tonight when there's a break in the rain. That way I can show off some of that. But I don't particularly want to go outside and get wet. So, pulled out one of my tourniquets. And this one, very specifically, says trainer on it. I only buy 2 brands of tourniquets, and that's either a Cat 5 or I've got a handful of the Rhino Rescue ones. I get the Cat 5, I think it's North American Rescue. And, when you look up tourniquets, those are, top of the line. It's what our military uses, it's what police and firefighters use. And if you look up anything about tourniquets, those are the ones that you should get. I specifically picked up a couple of the Rhino Rescues about 2.5 years ago, when there was a news article and a couple people on YouTube were talking about them, because this company, people could buy these tourniquets and send them to Ukraine. And at the time, that the company released an article saying, that their tourniquets had saved over 40,000 lives. And so they were being actively combat tested. And there was huge debates on, it's, $5 to $10 cheaper than a North American Rescue. They don't have the same testing standards, and I wouldn't trust myself with that. And don't get me wrong, there are knockoff cat tourniquets out there that go for half the price, or I've seen sometimes where you buy 4 of them for $30. And yes, I would not trust any of those. But I'm going to trust this one because of the active testing that's going into it. Maybe not nearly as much as the North American Rescue one that I have in my trauma kit, and my IFAC. I've got those. I also have one of these. So I carry one in my IFAC, and I've got 2 in my trauma kit. And I don't want to see how that goes, but I have trainer written on one of these because this is the one that I've taught first aid with my scouts. I've put on my cousin's arm and leg, and he's put on mine. And you don't want to use one that you've constantly tightened and strained down, when you actually need to use it. I've got 5, I think I have 5 tourniquets. If it really came down to I need to stop bleeding on a limb, every other one's been used, and this is the one sitting there. I'm going to use this over, a belt or, some sort of homemade kind of tourniquet. I've got this one, pre-staged to where it could fit over my leg if I want it to fit over my leg. Or it's definitely going to fit over my arm. And so the little bit of training that you do with this, if you're using it for your arm, the very first time that you're practicing one of these, you can sit here, use both of your arms. I'm lifting my arm up so I can get it, nice and high. That's something else that I've noticed. The more you use tourniquets, kind of the looser this fabric gets on it. And I probably should have done this the other way so I can pull it tighter. This is why we're sitting here practicing. And the training scenarios that you go through with this is, I'm sitting here chit-chatting with y'all, pulling it tight, not going, fast or anything with it. And I'm using my second arm. This is the simplest way to practice. You do it the absolute easiest way possible. And I guess before I tighten it is, I have heard two different things. There's justification for both of them. But say you've got, gaping wound in your forearm. You put the tourniquet 2 to 3 inches above that gaping wound, and then you tighten it down. And it's really fun in training to sit here and tighten it down. Real life situation, you're looking for blood to stop flowing from the wound, which you're not going to do that in a training. And so then you check the wrist for a pulse, and you should not get a pulse out of it. And the argument that I've heard from that is when you put it a couple of inches above the wound, if it is still bleeding, then you can apply another tourniquet. They don't say loosen that tourniquet and, retighten it, because that's going to re-increase the bad blood flow. And, I don't have, big old super meaty arms, but I've got all of this extra. And so, I can sit here, I can put it on my bicep. If there's any wound around here, you're not going to want to put it, over the elbow joint or over the knee joint, or, right at the ankle or wrist. But, we can Velcro it down. And that's when they say start twisting. And you twist until you cannot, get another twist in it. And it's got a little spot that you can sit here. They also say pre-stage it. Where the only purpose of this flap is, yes, it kind of helps keep this from popping back out. And it's got a little spot that says time, where you should keep, a Sharpie in your stuff. See, and it's already, it's not super tight yet, but I already feel the pinching effect, and I'm going to sit here and talk with y'all with it on, so I'll just kind of, twist it and tuck it in. But you can sit here, pull this over. That's going to help keep it from popping out. You write down the time that you put it on. Got some nice veins popping now. And flexing that tricep muscle makes it hurt. It should be uncomfortable. like you are cutting off the circulation to the lower part of his limb. And if I really truly wanted to test it, I could sit here, take my watch off, pulse is very, very weak. I could have gotten maybe one, I know I definitely could have gotten one more twist in, possibly two more twists. So I'll go ahead and loosen that so that, yeah, I can immediately feel, a strong sense of warmth going back into my arm. So in your training and your practice, I've heard people say put it a few inches above the wound. That way, if you need to apply another tourniquet, you can place one above it. My time in the Army, they always said high and tight. You put it as close to the top of the limb, as close to the groin as you can, and you're cranking. And there was definitely times where, they get that crank in, and you almost start jumping out of your pants. And the argument there is, high and tight, it is very painful. And, we're sitting here wearing, our ASUs and everything. And even through that, it's painful. You put it at the highest point, the blood flow should definitely stop. You're checking for a pulse and making sure it's not there. And the argument with that is, now anything below that, any new injury, doesn't really matter because that entire limb has had the circulation cut off. And I've heard the arguments, leave it on, if it's on for more than 4 hours, if it's on for more than 8. I've heard people say up to 24 hours before you really start to worry about, loss of limb. For all of us and our situations, the two things we were always told was we want the person to be alive and not dead. Life over limb. We can figure things out on how to survive. Missing a limb. So, I sat there and I chit-chatted while I put it on. I've got a nice little, circular indentation going down my arm. The veins aren't popping anymore. But you get one of these and you go through that motion of putting it on one of your limbs. If you're putting it on your leg, you use both of your arms. Practice on your right and your left. When you put it on your arms, you use both of your arms. And then you kind of increase the intensity. I'm going to put it on my left leg, and I can only use my left arm. Maybe my right arm's broken. And you just kind of flip through those different scenarios. And you also time yourself. I think they told us 30 seconds to get this put on. When they first started timing us, it was they gave you 90 seconds. And, then you just kind of slowly drop that time down. People have made some insane little gadgets. Like, I've seen some police departments where you're basically pre-wearing leg tourniquets already. And it's as simple as, it already has, a ratchet that's just, it's almost like you're wearing a climbing harness. If you got shot in the leg, they're not fumbling to put a tourniquet on. It's right there. And so, they shoot you with a paintball gun in the leg, and it's immediate. You hit the ground and you're cranking the little ratchet down. Some people have said those are nice. Some people have said, I'm not going to trust that over, my cat tourniquet. If I'm getting shot in the leg, how terrible would it be to get shot, right in this little harness, and now you got a big old hole in it, and you're ratcheting it down, and the strap breaks because they shot a hole through the strap. With that same argument, you could be stuck in a mortar attack or whatever, some sort of explosive that shreds your tourniquet and shreds your arm and your leg. Some people have argued, you have to carry 4 tourniquets because you have 4 limbs. I think that's a little bit excessive. Most people aren't carrying 1 tourniquet, let alone 2. If it's a trauma bag that you keep in your vehicle and, it's a big old duffel, you might as well have, 4 or 5 of these sitting in there. If it's an IFAC on a chest rig, you're not going to carry 4 of them. You're going to carry 1, possibly 2. And, this is one of those skills that, I might pull this out once every couple of months. I'm sitting at my desk. I'm, watching a YouTube video. I kind of see, I wait for the clock to hit a fresh minute. I pull this out and I time, how fast I can, get this thing going. I've got it sitting in a tool chest over here with a bunch of other medical stuff. I could be in the kitchen. How fast can I go from the kitchen to here to grab this to slide this on? You just kind of play around with it. You're sitting in your vehicle. Let's say, you pulled into a Walmart parking lot. How quickly can you go from your driver's seat to getting the tourniquet out of your pack and applying it to, just pick a limb? And you run through this with all the different people in your group. You get a little bit of frustration out, cranking this down on someone's leg. You can't feel it. You're just turning and they're squirming, and, then you check for a pulse, and now it's your turn. And, maybe they're going to put extra half crank into it because you put it on them really, really tight. And then you don't mess around with it for, 3-4 weeks, a couple of months, something along those lines. And, if it's something that you're like truly worried about, there's nothing saying every Saturday I'm practicing with the tourniquet. I want to get that time, as short as possible. We do that for training for everything. I'm a lifeguard instructor. They have to go from the stand to the furthest point in the pool and get someone out and go through like the preliminary check, to say, do they need CPR or not, in 90 seconds. Some places, 80 seconds might be the fastest time. The way the guard stands are set up, and the furthest point, you're swimming 35 yards. Some places, it can probably accomplish in, 25 seconds. If you're a lifeguard that's watching, a slide exit, you could probably be in the water and at the person in 5 seconds. And, your little splash out area is, 10 feet away. But you're constantly trying to beat that time. I think at our pool, we've had a couple people get it in under a minute, but you also have new people coming and going all the time. You have new levels of competitiveness. We had plenty of people that could get their IFAC, out of, or get their tourniquet out of their IFAC, uh, and get it tightened down with no pulse, about 15 seconds. You're not gonna get much quicker than that. Especially, like just that pulling it out. You can't go any quicker. Putting it on your arm, you can't go any quicker. Tighten it, like some things take time. But you can get pretty good and efficient with it. You can run through scenarios. Once everyone in your house, can put this on and, have no pulse at the end of the limb. And once you've practiced, getting it on very, very quickly, then you can make a game of it. You're sitting there watching TV. Bang, you were just shot in the leg. Go put your tourniquet on. And you could just throw that out there. You're pushing the cart full of groceries back. Bang, you were just shot in the arm. It takes you 50 seconds to, deal with that person. Oh, hey, in that time, you've lost a decent amount of blood. Your right arm is useless. And it's still gushing out. Go put your tourniquet on. Like, you can make it interesting. You can make it fun. And, that's completely up to you on how much you want to train on it. I think the nice thing about this is, you get your training tourniquet. The unit I was in, some of these were starting to look really, really ratty. I remember we threw several of them away. And, we had a captain that was like, yeah, I bought those tourniquets like 5 or 6 years ago. And, we just wrote trainer on them, and, I'm surprised they lasted this long. This is one of those things, even if you have like a 10-person group, I've had this tourniquet for a couple of years. It's probably been applied, at least 100 times. Probably more, but, maybe closer to 200 times. And if I didn't write trainer on it, I probably would not know that it's already been used. It's not, just falling apart and, looks all terrible. But you spend your money, and if you take care of it, you leave it in a tote or whatever. This is something that you can continue. Like, you're not buying bullets, to go to the shooting range, and being upset that bullets cost a lot of money, and I don't get to practice shooting as much as I want to, which is terrible. I would love to shoot more. The last thing I'll say is, we shouldn't just be worried about putting holes in people. We should be worrying about how to take care of holes in people. And this is one of the main things that helps with that. So, get you a tourniquet. Put it on your limbs. Tighten it down. You'll know if you're doing it right because it's going to feel painful. You are cutting the circulation off from that limb. And check for a pulse. Have other people check, because maybe your mind's playing tricks on you. You should know fairly quickly, though, because within a couple of minutes, that blood is cut off, the arm starts to go numb, and it feels tingly. For a training environment, having it on for a few minutes is not going to cause, any real harm. All of the medical people argue several hours to 24 hours. So, like, the marks on my arm are basically gone. I can kind of see it a little bit on the tricep on the back. But, you know, don't don't crank this down and then go take a nap. That would be a problem, and you might be a psychopath if you're sleeping with a tourniquet, put on properly. Uh, and just run through this with all of your different people. Make sure everyone knows how to use it and kind of what they're going for. And if you do that, you're probably in a better position than, I think 85% of people is a good number to say, mostly because this is one of those things that people in the military, police, EMS also know how to do. Depending on your job, they probably also talk and, discuss how to use these. So, yeah, I'd say probably 85% of the US population doesn't know how to use this. But let me know in the comment section down below a skill that you want me to go over. Subscribe to the channel, share it with everyone you know, all your friends, all your family, anyone that would benefit from these discussions. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.